It's not very often I make a video about conversations happening online, but this one time, I think it had to happen. I've seen a lot of creators, primarily in the Rebirth category, complaining about stacking. And if you're somebody who doesn't listen to the internet drama occurring, stacking is what some people are referring to as teamwork. We're talking about people who are upset that people are playing together, working together in individual buildings, and stacking together as a group in order to take out people who push them. Now, yes, all of us have the wonderful experience every once in a while where you run into a room and there's three guys in each corner. And it is frustrating, there's no doubt about that. The last way you want to die in a game of Warzone is to three dudes absolutely not moving inside a room. The problem with this debate and how people are approaching it is that you have two entire sets of groups who are just completely unaware of how the world works. You have a group of high caliber players, high KD players, streamers, and creators who are frustrated at people stacking in buildings and working together as a unit. And then you've got regular people who ultimately are just trying to string together a win, and arguably are a huge audience who are just lost in this conversation. The vast majority of the time when people are stacking or playing together in Warzone, they're doing so because it's the first game they've played in a couple of days, or in a couple of weeks, or maybe they just finished a 12-hour shift. And the reality is, they don't really care how they win the game, so long as they get a win, and that's perfectly normal. It would be very easy of me to take this video and talk about casual players versus high KD, competitive and committed players, and have a long conversation about who's right, who's wrong, yada yada yada. But in reality, they're both kind of right. And we're going to talk about it in this video today because Warzone is evolving. And whilst Warzone has evolved in terms of playstyles, in terms of the average player base, what it hasn't evolved ahead of is the meta of its own gameplay and the mechanics available in the game. In the case of Warzone, the reality is the average player is far better than they were when this game originally released in 2020. People know to work together now. People know that success is driven in numbers, and people know that if they play the game accordingly in a certain way and move from position to position, as a team, you can probably get a win. And that is perfectly acceptable. That is within the confines of Warzone and what is to be expected within gameplay. But on the flip side of that, Warzone is arguably the most aggressive battle royale. It is a royale that rewards people challenging each other, it has aggressive movement systems, and generally speaking is a game that's known in terms of reputation for being more high action, more fast paced, and more intense. So you have these two very conflicting game senses, people who are looking for wins and people who are ultimately trying to play what they feel to be the purest form of Warzone. But rather than talking about playstyles and how people are hoping to achieve things, what we need to be talking about is how Warzone isn't enabling more variety in the game. Warzone at the moment, in terms of lethals, equipment, things that you can use in field upgrades, is split down the middle between passive and aggressive. And there's nothing in between, like a control element that allows players to try a more unique dynamic game style. You can either choose bouncing betties, claymores, and abilities that allow you to sit into buildings, or you can play with frag grenades, thermites, so on and so forth, stun grenades and flashes, and try your best to push an opponent. And this very linear attack and defense option ultimately isn't enough for how much Warzone has progressed. I'm going to steal some examples from other games now to talk about how these abilities, equipments, and things can work in such a way to create an in-between playstyle. Something that will allow players who want to be aggressive and take out squads who are maintaining a position an option to do so, whilst also allowing players who are maintaining those positions to counter it themselves. The first example is from Valorant, and Valorant has an agent called Viper, and Viper has the ability to fire a small toxic chemical into any given building, position, or location, which drops a toxic floor on the ground. And if you're standing within the area of impact of where this is, and you don't get away from it, you will have decayed health. And what that means is whilst you haven't technically taken any damage and your health can go back up to maximum, and your armor isn't impacted, for a temporary period of time, so long as you are within the toxic element, your health will deteriorate, meaning that if somebody decides to push you or attack you at that moment, you would have less chance against that person than you would in normal circumstances. And this is a very effective feature in Valorant because it forces players to move out of locations or forces them to accept the consequences of the position that they're playing in. Meaning that if 3 people were in a building in Warzone and I fired some kind of toxin ability into the building or something that had a similar effect, it would mean that those players either have to rotate out of the building and challenge me as an opponent, or they would have to sit inside, face the decay consequences, and challenge me with lesser help. And the problem with Call of Duty's abilities and equipments, generally speaking, is that they don't allow for this in-between gameplay. Something like a tear gas grenade is not a good example because a tear gas grenade stops everybody within the area from shooting. So if you throw a tear gas grenade in the building, you can't exactly push off of it yourself. Next is an example from Rainbow Six Siege. Dockerby is somebody who has the ability to hack into enemy cell phones on the opposing team, forcing them to vibrate and make noise. This is really cool because it exposes the positions of enemies, giving players who are going to make an attacking push more intelligence into the surroundings that they're facing. An ability akin to this in Warzone would create an audible cue for opponents within a set location. So if you decided to attack in a building, you could possibly throw down a field upgrade that would cause something similar, an audible cue to locate the individual players within a building and make an educated guess whether you should push that opponent, or if you decide to push them, have more of an idea where they actually are. Now, before I carry on talking about these abilities, which I think are the hybrid in-between of attacking and defending, there's 2 points I want to touch on. Both of the abilities that I've mentioned so far can be used both defensively and offensively. A decay ability can slow down a team who are rushing a building, just like a Dockerby ability that identifies opponents in an area can also be used to predict where attackers are going to come from. So these aren't one-sided things aimed at punishing players who like to work together as a team or aimed at punishing players for holding positions. But the second thing, and arguably the most important thing, is that I keep mentioning them as field upgrades. Because right now, in my view, Call of Duty is far too heavily reliant on lethals and tacticals. And I actually think some of these lethals and tacticals are so important to the game that we either need expanded options or we need to start considering field upgrades or other alternative methods to bring the playstyles in. I'll give you an example right now. Snapshot grenades are arguably a really important tool for identifying where opponents may be, similar to the Dockerby effect that I've mentioned so far. But the problem that you have with that right now is that smoke grenades are an absolute must for the fundamental ways that Call of Duty works in terms of rotations, escaping gunfights, so on and so forth. And while certain tacticals and lethals almost become an absolute to how Call of Duty operates, especially smoke grenades, then we need to explore other options. For example, what if there was a field upgrade that activated a barrage of smoke instantly, allowing me to use things like snapshot grenades and stun grenades in order to challenge my opponents? We've recently seen the introduction of bunker buster bombs into Warzone, and the reception was quite tame because people were worried about how much it would change general positional gameplay. But something like a bunker buster that was primarily smoke grenades or primarily a decay option would be really valuable resources. And Call of Duty could greatly do with changing either field upgrades or certain kill streaks to introduce new options that give players small advantages in certain situations rather than absolute power. Everything in Call of Duty requires players to have instant damage. You have to have a grenade that does 300 damage, or you have to have, some kind of kill streak that has to level everything inside it. But very few things allow for nuance in between, and that's what we're missing right now. We're missing that hybrid role between attack and defense, and we're missing things that just give you subtle advantages as opposed to major advantages in terms of damage output. I guess the easiest way that I can summarize the problem that we're facing in Warzone is to give you an example of how things work in other games. And I am going to use Valorant again. I've been playing a lot of it recently, and I've got a good understanding of it, to talk about how Warzone could improve. Now, in Valorant, you have duelists and you have sentinels, which are ultimately attackers and defenders. They have abilities that can be used invertedly, but for the most part, that is their entire role, attacking or defending. If you're a duelist, you're there to win your fights. If you're a sentinel, you're there to lock down a location. And you can arguably think of this as attacking players in Warzone or sentinels in Warzone, people who sit tight. But in Valorant and in other games like Rainbow Six Siege, and generally in the wider first-person shooter space, you have hybrid roles in between. In Valorant, they're called initiators. Initiators are players who gather intelligence, they have the ability to identify player positions, often come with things like flash grenade abilities, and you also have controllers. And controllers are there to deny certain areas or attack certain areas with their abilities. And generally speaking, I think that's what Call of Duty is completely missing. Every single ability and every single option in this game is either entirely offensively minded, like a airstrike, or defensively minded, like a cluster mine. Nothing works on the in-between. Nothing can be used in that category that allows players subtle advantages here or there, leading to this huge problem between quote-unquote stacking gameplay and these players who are higher skill or higher KD who want to fight everything in between them. The reality is that Call of Duty doesn't have enough tools at the moment to break down squads, and they need to start providing them in ways that aren't overwhelming to the people who are playing. I think the reality is now is that most Warzone players are a lot better than they used to be, and I think Call of Duty needs to start providing ways for the game to have a bit of experimentation. The Bunker Buster Bomb was widely received with bad PR because people were worried that it was just going to be an extremely overpowered kill streak that takes everybody out of the equation. But some of the suggestions I've made today, like a decaying ability or something like a field upgrade that pings enemy opponents within a certain location, these are all stages in between something that's extremely overpowered attacking and defensive wise that create more dynamic gameplay within Warzone. And I really hope Warzone looks into this because it would genuinely make the gameplay so much more interesting. I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feelings about this because it's something that I think I probably understand to an extent but don't know the full half of. Now, from a personal level, I find stacking gameplay can be frustrating at times, but I'm also aware of the fact that it's down to me to try and create the windows to get those kills, as hard as that can be in some situations. And I think the suggestions I've made today are things that can be used for both sets of players on any type of playstyle to give you more options. And I think that's what's missing from Warzone. I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feelings in the comment section below. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll catch you again in the next one.